Hello, my name is Dr. Rob S. Rice, and I write historical fantasy. I write historical fantasy that takes place quite often in the era before mechanical transport. Now, if you write in an era taking place before the mechanical transport, you're going to spend a lot of time talking about horses. Horses have to eat a lot. Horses have to be taken care of carefully. They need water. They need rest. They need time. And if you treat a horse like just another machine, your story is going to ring false. So this story here, which is from my reading from my story, The Affair of the Superfluous Hunter, which you'll find in my book, Darkness in the Mirror. A detective, an Afghani, and a doctor are trying to figure out if a couple of horses were human, if a couple of horses knew what happened to a human. They're trying to interrogate animals that don't think the way people do. Animals are not people. They have very different motivations. They have different ways of looking at the world, very different ways of dealing with their lives. I hope you'll find my effort to grasp this issue and the matter of taking care of and hiding a horse worth listening to. Thank you so much. It was a curious trip. I chose a private compartment as much by reason of my silent companion's outre appearance as for my own comfort and isolation. The little Afghani did return a smile when I passed him a French roll from my bag and a traveling cup filled with the water I'd drawn from the little butt at the car's entrance. In silence, except for the repeated noises of the train itself, we soon found ourselves at Oxford. It was just time to catch a coach for Bladen, but outside the inn there I at first saw no one. I blew out with some weariness at the prospect of a 5-mile walk to the barn itself, and I was uncertain of the way. At that moment I heard a cheery halloa from behind the inn and looked over to see Matthew Maguire waving up at me from his seat in a governess cart, a little trap being pulled by the fuzzy brown Dartmoor pony. I complimented Maguire on anticipating our train. He noted he hadn't figured us for the early arrival. Simple logic. Jacob Ali clasped his hand to his forehead and bowed to Maguire, who repeated the gesture and lifted up the Afghani's satchel and box, storing both carefully under his legs. Maguire next hoisted me up next to him in the tiny gig. At a sign from the detective, Jacob Ali hopped nimbly onto the long step at the back, sitting cross-legged, while Maguire touched up the pony and took us bouncing merrily along the village roads. I balanced my bag and valise upon my knees with as much dignity and comfort as I could muster, not with any great quantity of either. Maguire turned his typically twinkling eye upon me. "It's not a gentleman's proper turnout, I'll grant you, Doctor, but it was the best I could manage at the price, that being gratis, for I rescued our chariot from a ditch and made such repairs as I could manage. The harness is third-hand and most likely stolen, although I had the grace to check for the Marlborough seal upon the traces." "Where did they find the body?" There were things I cared about more than our conveyance. "Ah, that. They only found the body after I did, and something else besides, which is why I leave our little Asian friend back there seeing visions in the dust kicked up behind us. Could you please get on with it, man?" I plead the stress of it all and the strain the last week had been upon me. I can be polite, boy. Does that amaze you? Pray that you'll have a friend like I was to Max or Maguire was to me when you need one. Maguire was hard to offend. The truly dangerous men often are. "I had much to occupy myself, Dr. Buzzard, beside the mere matter of procuring our transportation and making yon pony start the worth of his keep, which he does quite well for a suspected schoolmaster. Your beastie has been in a way of doing that when I let him about. You'll recall me intending that. Ask it if any knew who'd bought him. I don't worry myself a great deal about our friend Scroggins would appear to claim him himself, what with Mr. Barrymore's case being the talk of the parish. But if another had, I would have been more than pleased to make that new fellow's acquaintance. Instead, I found a dealer in Woodstock who recognized the beast. It was none other than Scroggins, who'd bought him." He laughed. "I think I'm all right in my idea that yon Dartmoor's of the Arcting persuasion he was let go at a price for being lame, and you can see he's quite sound on all 4 of his feet around folk he trusts. That was the day your German disappeared, and so whatever they did to our little friend here, it didn't take them long. We may be asking Mr. Ali back there to clarify the matter for us as well. The body, man, please." He nodded, almost apologetically. "So Scroggins had that much more of a reason for being in my special interest. You can be sure that I suspected he had some idea that some friend of yours, besides your German, might yet be in the area, and I didn't particularly mind when he caught a glimpse of me across yon field and lingering near his barn. He steered well clear of the place ever since, which gave me some peace at night, and a chance to do some pony tending and cart mending, but not to learn too much besides." We had stopped the little cart by that time, Maguire swinging his legs up and out with a practiced ease, offering me a hand which I was loath to admit I needed as I handed him my baggage, and then joined him on the ground. The little Pathan was hitching the pony with an experienced stableman's prowess and taking him by the bit over toward the field, toward the barn. Maguire gave me a knowing smile and tugged the rig into a bramble-covered pit of some sort next to the road. Without too much effort, our cart was soon entirely lost to view. Maguire did not wait to be prompted. "And so I was back in my beard and ragman's coat of that evening, raking away at the pathways. It's a great problem for a man keeping a horse in secret. The beast will need to be fed and not likely to be quiet about his lack of nourishment if he's kept from getting his own fodder. Scroggins took his meals in bed in an inn at Woodstock. I had that from the pony dealer, and he'd be in the need of a place for the horse. You'd be understanding when I said I was not amazed to find out whose house should be mainly on a line between Scroggins' bed and Woodstock and work. That was done at the Barrymore farm, where I'd heard from the farmer's own wife that her husband was proven most amenable to Mr. Scroggins passing his hours with them both, and in whose barn I found a most elegant Irish hunter, not the sort of beast your average Oxfordshire farmer is likely to buy or keep. I had to acknowledge his skill. Simple logic again. Oh, that Battermouth has become a great friend of Mr. Scroggins, and I'm thinking it might have something to do with whatever it was that made a Goodman farmer agreeable to the matter of running a hayfork through your back, Doctor, and not saying a word thereafter. I nodded. There was sense there. Scroggins had a hold enough on the farmer to bring him out of the cataleptic state in which McGuire and I had left him. That would be more than likely to be a residual enough effect to produce the behavior on the farmer's part that McGuire had noted since. And the matter of our missing German, I had the time to be thinking while I was keeping my eyes peeled and doing a bit of raking around the palace walkways. Gentry such as the Marlboroughs are likely to want their wine well chilled if they can get the ice for it, and there's ponds enough in the park to justify an ice house, or even two, there are two, within the Duke's bounds. I found the remains of your friend wrapped up in the missing sheet from his bed inside the one further from the palace, deep in a pile of straw and sawdust, where a trained man could see the ice had been shifted. So you went to the police? No, I decided to make some use of my knowledge for another merry jape upon our friend Scroggins. I left your German and his winding sheet in the box where our friend Scroggins had left our wee associate at Dartmoor here, and set our murderous chorister in ambush. That's one for them. Something to crease their brows, you might say. My jest seems to put the wind up the man enough, for in fact he's not been seen in the stable since, and by that a bit of foolishness has got the local peelers more than a little interested in him, as they long ought to have been. McGuire leaned back, stretching like a panther before bending again forward and drawing the whip lightly over the flagging pony's rump as he resumed. Whatever he is now, he's on foot, for I took the liberty of calling unannounced at the Barrymore's little farm and commandeering, as we used to say, Lord Churchill's horse. The beast was most cooperative, no one more than a third party might be expected to have the reckoning of its uses. That puts our friend in the palace at something of a loss for his supply of the drug you say that he's using and needs. It lets Mr. Scroggins know how badly he's covered his traces, and adds a nice ram of desperation to sour whatever bit of brew they're brewing. Scroggins and the mind behind him, the fellow who's so interested in getting that drug into our frolicsome lord, will be doing something drastic soon. The inquest is tomorrow, and you'll be my ears in the courtroom. It's my intention to stay as discreet in this business as circumstances allow me for as long as I'm given that privilege. But tonight we'll learn more than a little with the help of Jacob there. We were in the barn, finding the pony back in its rough stall, its head already buried in grass and flakes of hay, with the bales remaining along the barn wall. Jacob Ali was scratching the animal's ears and mane as the pony fed, turning to smile cheerfully up at us as we joined him within the shattered walls. McGuire had acquired a pair of wooden lawn chairs by that time and offered me one while he took a bit of breath and a drink of water from the large bucket next to the tent. You'll recall the Epsom investigations of 40 years back, will you not, Dr. Buzzard? How could I not? The ministry's been watching me ever since the early 60s, and they paused to make inquiry. The scandal had shaken the racing world quite badly. Horses going lame or losing inexplicably. One or two of the favourites even dying before they could take the stakes. Eventually, plainclothesmen from Whitehall approved the existence of a criminal syndicate linked to the Adam Worth organization. Behind it all, through the testimony of men actually taking an attempt upon one of the animals. I said as much to McGuire. A man tends to be observant when he finds himself dragged into the police business, but would only a few of us in the profession know what exactly our friends the fixers were taken by their collars. That was with the help of yon Afghan gentleman, who, as you can see, is more than a wee bit fond of horses. The pony had finished its meal and was nuzzling Jacob agreeably, puffing breath companionably over the little man's face. McGuire was getting to his feet again. He waved me back to my seat as he got up and fastened his coat. I know 3 people and someone besides who can get a story out of a horse about what it's seen and experienced. 2 years ago I visited 2 of the 3 at no place besides the farm of General Schuyler Hamilton, United States Army, retired. That's right, Doctor, your same patient during the hours of our adventuring. The one's the horse himself, that'll be Robert Allen. No, Hamilton obeyed his general's orders and need not shave his neck. I think you had a bit of a look at our Robert in those giddy days when he was one, the other, and betwixt and between. The second you've not met, and that's a discharged American naval officer by the name of Commander Leroy Fitch, who was so kind as to visit General Hamilton when I did, and tell us what Robert was saying. He's got the gift, as you might say. He indicated the Pathan with his thumb. Jacob's the third, and he was the greatest use to the detectives who pretend ignorance of his name if you mentioned him. With the dark getting on, I'll be back directly with the horse I've found, strayed, that is, from Lord Churchill and his murderous groom. He's picketed in a safe little hollow. We'll very soon see if we can find out exactly who's the one we've been thanking for the fate of your friend Stahl. The hunter, when McGuire returned with him, was indeed a beast to excite the avidity of any man of wealth who prized prime horseflesh. The first thing I noticed were the animal's clear blue eyes, about which something struck both the little Pathan mute and myself. Jacob Ali hissed a sudden breath. I found myself staring searchingly back into the animal's gaze. The eyes were well apart and ahead of some heaviness, but that denoting more than a strength of frame than the draft's bred bulk. I would guess his height at the shoulder at 16 hands. His pelt was a light dapple gray, gleaming in what little evening light crept in through the holes in the walls, tail white, mane shading toward the blackish. His proportions were exquisite, and a finer animal could not, I thought, and even McGuire agreed, be easily found. He stood quietly, looking at us both in turn as McGuire stroked his longish neck. The pony in the corner made a curious sound. The hunter at once swung his head and ears forward and took a step or two to touch noses to the other animal. They seemed agreeable to each other's company. McGuire took the paper bag out from under his arm and handed that to the Asian, who looked within, smiled, and distributed some shriveled but sweet apples to the hunter, the pony, and to each of us standing by in turn. For a quiet moment, the inhabitants of McGuire's field headquarters took refreshment together. McGuire moved his makeshift wicket and left the obliging hunter within, the pony as quickly moving to lean against the larger beast comfortably. McGuire looked over. I'd say there's not a better moment forthcoming to be commencing this business with Jacob. There's a rising chance of danger to our fortification here now that Scroggins is likely to have found the animal likewise missing from his string, and only a limited number of places in which such a beast might be safely kept. Let's the two of us stand on guard, and I see, Dr. Buzzard, that you've availed yourself of the work of P. Webley and Son. All the while the little Asian remained staring quietly at the horses. I do not think the revolver in my bag had more than clinked. Perhaps he had seen the open box of cartridges in my coat pocket. He was not the sort to overlook such things. At any rate, in response to McGuire's touch upon his shoulder and gestures toward the box and each of the horses, the little man nodded agreeably and removed a silver key depending on a chain he had worn down the back of his neck beneath his clothing. While with this he opened the small lock box I had received from Arvo Woundberry. There indeed, the smell confirmed it, lay a hasty quantity of the drug the Hindu had named. I approve of hashish no more than opium, but apparently it had some role to play in Jacob Ali's ability to fathom the thought of horses in the limited scope of existence his loss of facilities had left him. Out came a pad composed of sheets of white paper with a thin wooden back and a number of charcoal pencils, apparatus such as one might well encounter along the vistas of the Paris boulevards. McGuire moved a hay bale as close to where the animal stood as he could manage, while Jacob Ali removed a silver spoon from a fob pocket in his tunic and ate an even measure of the drug. He afterwards sat down quietly, the spectacles he continued to wear conspicuously hiding the condition of his eyes, perhaps for the very reason of his habitual ingestion of the drug. The little Pathan kept petting both the horses in turn, the hunter leaning over to sniff at the box for a moment, the pony content to stand quietly with its new stablemate in the building evening chill. Suddenly, Jacob Ali drew up sharply. He looked almost indignantly up at the Irish hunter and then looked accusingly over at McGuire, indicating the hunter and shaking his head. You can imagine that McGuire and I exchanged some very significant glances. With an apologetic pat, McGuire lifted up the hunter's lip. The animal backed a step, but was on the whole agreeable about having its mouth prized open. I took my own look. I was not horsey enough to determine the animal's age, but the incisors and the big chewing molars looked as worn as any horses of proven origin that I'd ever seen. There was nothing unusual about the animal's shod feet, but something had provoked astonishment in our equine translator. McGuire cocked his head. I tried my usual question. Max, is that you? The pony at once repeated its 1, 2, 3 nod and shaking forehoof. The hunter looked at me with confusion only, its upper lip working over our hands, once our hands had withdrawn from its face. I ran my hand down the back of its neck while the hunter remained at hand. At precisely the places a trained man would expect were the telltale knots of small scabs that spoke of needles inserted beneath the animal's hide. McGuire indicated the pad, making an elegant shrug of his shoulders. Suddenly the little Pathan's hand seized one of the sticks of artist charcoal and worked in strong, broad, swift strokes for about a minute. He then presented the result of his efforts to us both. It was the snarling head of what was clearly a tiger, fangs exposed and feral eyes gleaming. Jacob Ali touched the noses of both animals significantly. McGuire had his hat off and was running his fingers through his hair. That image is in the mind of both our fellow lodgers, I'd say, Dr. Buzzard. Have you ever given thought to exactly how a horse thinks? I said I imagined that the detective's understanding would be better than mine. You'd think that, given my tale of Robert Allen and Leroy Fitch across the sea, you'd think that horses express themselves in words such as anyone else might use. That's not rightly the true way of it. Leroy Fitch is a man with a gift. Robert Allen was a sergeant of the United States Dragoons before the world took him from being a rider to becoming a mount. And both of them interpret what they got from horses in words, such as we're using now. McGuire indicated the sketch. But a true horse, whatever we've got here, has no capacity for words or letters. It's in pictures, he thinks, if you can call that thinking at all. He's hungry in a foal, it's his dam and her udder he sees in his mind until his nose and eyes tell him that he's seen it for real. It's a bit like a dream. He's older, and the grass on the meadow and the scent of good oats on the side of his nosebag he's wanting, and he roams and sniffs until he finds either. But he asks for it with all the force of his lungs. McGuire stared thoughtfully at the sketch, which showed with considerable skill, aside from the source of the path and subject. I've still got those charcoals, boy, in a strong box. Don't ask me where. McGuire handed one back to me. But where would a fat little Dartmoor pony and a valuable Irish hunter be seeing this, I'm wondering? There was nothing to be said. Jacob Ali resumed stroking the two animals, who seemed to respond with only a slight movement of their ears and heads as he continued. Once more the stick of a charcoal darted down upon the paper, and an even more curious image appeared. What looked like a truncated obelisk with some sort of inscriptions upon the recessed flattened end of it. From the base of the lower cut, a single arm extended upwards, and on that a circular disc. The entire image was hauntingly familiar to me. McGuire had no ideas, but the Pathan's confident touches indicated once again that he had found this queer image in the thoughts of both animals. McGuire was patting the pony's neck by way of moving the smaller animal away from the hunter. Inasmuch as horses do idle conversing, which they do when there's nothing to be quarrelled over or feared, these two have had a mite to say to each other. They both seen that tiger in yon obelisk, is that the word? And as the one man from another shire, you'll forgive another for thinking that neither tigers nor the works of ancient Egypt are likely to be found in the environs of Baleden. I had nothing to say, and so said nothing. McGuire had gently moved the pony behind Jacob Ali's reach, so signifying to the little man he was to concentrate his attentions upon the new arrival. The Pathans paused to lip up another small portion of his oracular drug, then continued gently stroking the hunter's nose. The animal tolerated the attentions with more than the usual patience one finds in stables. I heard Jacob's Ali's voice, what there was of it, hissing softly. Our heathen friend is probing a bit more deeply, McGuire whispered quietly. There's a pattern to such things. He'll be trying to find where yon beast is from his older memories, if they're still there. Most useful in the case of theft. Up came the pad, down came a fresh stick of charcoal. Even the horse seemed to watch with interest as the Pathan made his third drawing. This one was much less enigmatic than its immediate predecessor, but wildly incongruous all the same. The finished drawing looked like something you'd see on a lower-class parlor wall. McGuire spoke the obvious first. "That sort of steamer by the look of it. Turrets fore and aft. Yon's an ironclad letting down a boat in harbour." I could not help but agree with the Liverpudlian's informed appraisal. I voiced the appropriate query. But why would a horse being asked of its origins ever think of a ship like that? I can imagine a horse transport, you recall those from Russia, but an ironclad? That's one of the more modern examples for that matter. Might have seen such from the deck that brought him over from Ireland, but unlikely. I'll stand bond for that. They don't let the horses on a transport up on deck until they're good and docked, and if there's a berth at hand for the transport, there's a berth for yon man of war. The second picture was of good perspective, a drawing of a third-class train compartment filled with sailors and navvies of an entirely normal description. I could almost read the names on the band of the closest star's hat. The only inexplicable thing about the picture was the second time its presence in the mind of a horse. Such a mystery was in no way posed by the third image received from the Pathan's scratching charcoal. The illustration appeared after a pause while McGuire lit and turned up the wick of a paraffin lamp he took from outside of the tent. He then left me to watch while he stepped out to patrol the purlieus of the barn. I recalled his forebodings that Scroggins and what lay behind him might well choose to investigate it. "I don't think Jacob Ali will have any more revelations for this quarter, do you see?" McGuire looked at the image, his brows furrowed, and he laughed and looked back up at me. "At first you'd think that, Doctor, but there's much to be learned here. You're right enough, it's this barn. But look you, here and here. I put up stones and timber since I found the place. You won't see the work of McGuire in this bit of scratching. The wall shown here's the one covered with the hay, and note yon. I saw it just today while lifting down a bit of supper for our boarder." McGuire lifted the lamp to show me a large iron staple set into the mortar between two of the barn's remaining stones. With the rust on, it was thick. A faint gleam could be made out along the length of iron where the old metal had been more recently disturbed. Upon my mentioning that, McGuire gave me a pleased smile. "You're commencing to learn the rudiments of a detective's profession. That's metal scratching metals there, but the yon iron was last officially used with a chain when Cromwell, the Lord's curse upon him, turned the cannon upon the house that stood here before the palace of the Marlboroughs. Prisoners lay in this barn, and one more recently since." I could not but ask him how he knew of the imprisoned royalists. He smiled, flicked a finger over his ear, and said merely that he had sources. One of them was Stiles' letter. When I asked him of the certainty of that a more recent prisoner had occupied these walls, he had reached down and lifted up a set of manacles of quite modern manufacture from where they lay obscured in the shadows. "That'll rest on that score, Doctor," buzzard. "One cuff of the old iron there, leaving scratches, the other's in some poor lad's wrist. I'm much more inclined for some reason to suspect it was the sailors put ashore on furlough, and surprised, as Barrymore was, in his way home." With those words, McGuire stayed long and thoughtfully up with the hunter, whose head was moving down past its knees as sleep overtook the animal. Jacob Ali drank some water, meaningfully putting aside his pad and charcoals, and slipped into nestle at the recumbent pony's flank as the two horses lay down in their shared enclosure. I think he slept the best of the humans that night. There was hay and blankets, but no better bed to be found, and I made a wretched pillow of my valise. McGuire did not have to insist with any particular emphasis that neither a bed in Woodstock's large inn nor one in Blenheim Palace would be any more secure for me that night.